Welcome, everyone, to the Prancing Pony Podcast. Nob and Bob are doing the dishes, so there are no pint glasses for the moment. But come on into the common room, we'll get some bread and cheese and have a little talk by the fire. Never mind that suspicious-looking ranger over there. I am the man of the West, Alan Sisto, and I'm not joined today by my co-host, Shawn Marchese, the real-life Lord of the Mark, who I hear is busy tracking down a band of stray Uruk-hai somewhere along the Western March. Like Shawn's spectacular effort earlier this week, this solo episode is my attempt to spend a bit of time exploring a particular topic from Tolkien's biographies that interested me. Fortunately, unlike Shawn's solo episode, I won't be speaking in foreign languages. No, I'll be talking a bit about the Great War, World War I, and how it influenced Tolkien's writings. Some of what I'll be talking about today comes from the Carpenter Biography and the volume of letters that we've talked about previously. Other information comes from a more recent work by Garth, Tolkien and the Great War, The Threshold of Middle-earth, as well as the J.R.R. Tolkien Companion and Guide by Christina Scull and Wayne Hammond. Links to all of these works are available on the library page of theprancingponypodcast.com. All right, well, since we're solo, we'll just dive right in. When people start discussing the inner meaning of Tolkien's works, or worse, when they start trying to find allegory where there isn't any, I am the first to throw a flag on the play. Okay, for our listeners not in the U.S., maybe I should say I'm the first to pull out a yellow card and book the offender. What I mean to say is that I simply take Tolkien at his word when he says things like, "As for any inner meaning or message, it has in the intention of the author none. It is neither allegorical nor topical." Or when he says something like, "The real war," in this case he's talking about World War II, "does not resemble the legendary war in its process or its conclusion." Or perhaps most famously, "I cordially dislike allegory in all its manifestations, and always have done so since I grew old and wary enough to detect its presence. I much prefer history, true or feigned, with its varied applicability to the thought and experience of readers. I think that many confuse applicability with allegory, but the one resides in the freedom of the reader, and the other in the purposed domination of the author." All that to say, I'm not one to go looking for one-to-one symbolism between events in Middle-earth and events in the real world. But Tolkien also admits that an author cannot, of course, remain wholly unaffected by his experience, and he reminds us that to be caught in youth by 1914, the start of World War I, was no less hideous of an experience than to be involved in 1939 and the following years, World War II. He then bluntly tells us, "By 1918, all but one of my close friends were dead." It seems reasonable, then, to look at World War I and expect to see some things in Tolkien's works that reflect that experience, again, even if they're not fully analogous. So let's start by looking at two specific things that Tolkien said that give good reason for seeing the Great War as influential, and then we'll separately do a little speculation. First, in a 1956 letter, reproduced in part as letter 187 in Carpenter's collection, Tolkien states that "My Samwise is indeed largely a reflection of the English soldier, of the privates and my batmen that I knew in the 1914 war, and recognized as so far superior to myself." Now, this topic alone, the subject of Sam as an illustration of the English Batman, could be enough to fill a short solo episode. And while that won't be the case today, a little information here could be helpful, since not all of our listeners will be familiar with the concept. A Batman was an enlisted soldier assigned to a commissioned officer as his personal servant, maintaining his uniform and kit, like a valet, among other duties. For those who are familiar with the recently ended television show Downton Abbey, Mr. Bates, the valet to Lord Grantham, once served as Lord Grantham's Batman in the Boer War. It wasn't uncommon for an officer's Batman to follow him into civilian life as a valet or butler or in some other domestic service role. Okay, now that you know what a Batman is, it should be easy to see some of that relationship between a Batman and his officer and the relationship between Sam and Frodo, his aristocratic employer. Now, the relationship there is not a formal one, but it clearly goes beyond that of a typical civilian master-servant relationship. It demonstrates the camaraderie of soldiers who've experienced combat together and whose lives have depended on one another. Sam, like a good Batman, is steadfastly loyal to Frodo. He also looks after Frodo's practical needs, cooking, fetching water, etc., as well as helping Frodo in his mission, even carrying him up the slopes of Mount Doom, as a Batman would often carry his wounded officer back to safety, or, more often, sadly, dying by his side. Now, in our last joint episode, we answered a listener's question about Sam being the hero, and we talked about some of the characteristics that make him one. Well, These are the same characteristics of the ideal World War I British soldier: courage, endurance, steadfastness, and a relentless optimism. So there's one other thing Tolkien said about the direct influence of World War I, and it specifically had to do with the influence on the landscape of Middle-earth. He said, "The dead marshes and the approaches to the Morannon owe something to northern France after the Battle of the Somme." I recently completed narration of an audiobook on World War I, The Great War, 1914 to 1918 by Hilary Brown. And as a result, I grew very familiar with descriptions of the trenches and no man's land on the Western Front. Make no mistake, the trenches were a horrible place. Dank water and mud often filled them. Rat infestations were commonplace, leading to trench fever and other diseases caused by parasites transmitted by lice. One could only see the sandbagged walls and the sky above, and a soldier might spend 2 months in a frontline trench before being recalled to a reserve trench. Now, as bad as the trenches were, no man's land was worse. An absolutely devastated, shattered landscape of building rubble, mud, shell craters, stripped tree trunks, and barbed wire, littered with the corpses of soldiers. An attack from the trenches meant going over the top and attempting to cross this hellish landscape in order to reach the enemy. Now, in the passage of the marshes, Frodo tells Sam and Gollum that the dead men lie in all the pools, pale faces, deep, deep under the dark water. I saw them, grim faces and evil, noble faces and sad, all foul, all rotting, all dead. This image of dead soldiers lying in pools of mud is a clear image of trench warfare from the Western Front, and even in the short time that Tolkien served on the front lines, he's likely to have encountered it. Now, in another passage that sounds reminiscent of No Man's Land, Tolkien says that dreadful as the dead marshes had been, and the arid moors of the No Man Lands, more loathsome by far was the country that the crawling day now slowly unveiled to his shrinking eyes. Here nothing lived, not even the leprous growths that feed on rottenness. The gasping pools were choked with ash and crawling muds, sickly white and gray, as if the mountains had vomited the filth of their entrails on the lands about. Now, particularly noticeable about this passage is his description of the muds as sickly white and gray, very much like the terrain of No Man's Land at the Somme, because the underlying ground there was a chalky bedrock that, when shattered by continuous artillery bombardment, turned the ground gray and white. Though Tolkien only acknowledges the Morannon and the dead marshes as owing something to the Somme battlefield, it doesn't seem unreasonable to see similarities to at least 2 other nearby regions of Middle-earth. The first is fairly obvious. It's Mordor. It's scarred with pits, much like shell craters, one of which Frodo and Sam hide in when escaping from the orcs, just like a soldier in World War I might hide in a shell crater from an enemy patrol. And like the battlefield, Mordor has no life at all except for the soldiers of the enemy. The natural world, trees, fields, and animals, were all annihilated by modern weaponry like artillery and machine guns. But there's one other land that comes to mind. It's Ithilien, not as a battlefield, of course, but as the countryside of France behind the front lines. Yes, there's some damage. Yes, it's a little different. Nobody's living there because of the nearby war. But the landscape itself is not yet under the sway of the enemy nor destroyed by war. Still, the sights and sounds, the reminders of war, whether it's artillery shells or the eruptions of Mount Doom, were never far away. Well, now we move on to elements from Tolkien's work that seem to find their inspiration from World War I, but for which we have no direct evidence. And of course, there's a lot more than just the short list I'm going to discuss. I'm trying to keep our episode brief. The first goes along with trench warfare. The clouds of ash and fume that would leave Sam and Frodo clutching their throats, gasping for air and desperate for water. It brings to mind images of the use of poison gas in trench warfare. Gas masks were mostly effective if a soldier got one on in time, but they were hard to fight in and definitely uncomfortable. The use of gas as a weapon was certainly an evil element in World War I that fit very perfectly with the concept of Mordor. The second is the smell of the places that Frodo and Sam travel. They're often described as having a foul or bitter smell, or even in a couple places literally as evil smelling, as though evil has a scent of its own. The battlefield stank as well. It smelled of chemicals, the chlorine gas and others, as well as the smell of gunpowder and explosives, but also of death itself. Animals, pack mules, draft horses, that were killed were left to rot. There was no safe way to dispose of their carcasses. And worse, the bodies of men killed in battle were often not retrieved or buried, especially those who died closer to enemy lines. And the next thing, though, is a little bit of a good thing. It's not all as pure terror and evil. That third thing that comes to mind is Sam's reaction lying up at night from the no-man's land of Mordor. And here's the passage from the text. Far above the Ephel-Duath in the west, the night sky was still dim and pale. There, peeping among the cloud rack above a dark tor high in the mountains, Sam saw a white star twinkle for a while. The beauty of it smote his heart as he looked up out of the forsaken land, and courage returned to him. For like a shaft, clear and cold, the thought pierced him that in the end the shadow was only a small and passing thing. There was light and high beauty forever beyond its reach. That's one of my all-time favorite quotes, especially from that third volume. I hope I'm not ruining our discussion of that chapter, which is currently scheduled for sometime in 2021, if I'm not mistaken. But the passage reminds me of a verse called Night in the Trenches. This was written by a British officer under a pseudonym, and it sounds vaguely familiar. The stars shine brilliantly, and, these trenches facing north, I gaze at the plough dipping towards Highwood. What joy it is to know that you in England and I out here at least can look upon the same beauty in the sky. They have become seers, images of divine stability, guardians of a peace and order beyond the power of weak and petty madness. They, at least, will outlast the war and still be beautiful. There's another thing that I'm reminded of, and that is shell shock. There's a moment in Return of the King when Aragorn is leading the armies of the west towards Mordor, that they pass through lands that Frodo and Sam traveled through earlier, and that's the desolation before the Morannon, the gates to Mordor. In this passage, they experience, even without falling artillery shells, what really seems to be shell shock, which is something certainly Tolkien would have been familiar with. Here's the quote. On the fourth day from the crossroads, they came at last to the end of the living lands, and began to pass into the desolation that lay before the gates of the pass of Cirith Gorgor. And they could descry the marshes and the desert that stretched north and west to the Emyn Muil. So desolate were these places, and so deep the horror that lay upon them, that some of the host were unmanned, and could neither walk nor ride further north. Aragorn looked at them, and there was pity in his eyes, for these were young men from Rohan, from Westfold far away, or husbandmen from Lesarnach, and to them Mordor had been from childhood a name of evil and yet unreal, a legend that had no part in their simple life, and now they walked like men in a hideous dream made true, and they understood not this war, nor why fate should lead them to such a pass. Now, fortunately, in contrast to how men suffering from shell shock were often treated in World War I, Aragorn has compassion and gives them another task requiring courage and bravery instead, sending them to recapture Caer Andros. As an aside, the cries of the Nazgul seem to inspire that same sort of shell shock symptoms for those who hear it. And again, I don't think that's a coincidence. Tolkien would have been aware of shell shock and would have experienced, if not experienced it himself, he certainly would have experienced it secondhand through other people in his company and other soldiers that he knew. The last thing that, and again, these are just speculation, but the last thing that reminded me of World War I was the way the lives of the four hobbits play out upon their return to the Shire. Seems to me it's a little bit like the way World War I veterans' lives played out on their return from the war. First you have Merry and Pippin. They fought and were wounded in battle, but they weren't subjected to the same experiences of terror that Frodo and Sam faced. It's like they saw combat, but not the brutal nature of trench warfare. Now, maybe I'm downplaying what Merry did in particular, but having faced the Black Rider, but it does seem like, at least in their return, they're put in some sort of a different category. They're able to very easily return to their normal upper-class hobbit lives, just wiser and more mature, able to take on the leadership roles that we see in Scouring of the Shire. But Sam and Frodo, well, their experience was more like those who had served long tours in the trenches of the Somme, based on their incredibly long journey to and through Mordor. Now, Sam came through it better off than Frodo. Maybe it was his relentless optimism, one of those World War I soldier characteristics. But the point is, he was able to put the terror of his experiences behind him. Like Merry and Pippin, he takes on a leadership role and is hailed as a hero. But Frodo's a little bit like the shell-shocked veterans who weren't able to fully recover from the horrors of war and had a far more difficult road. Now this was made worse, of course, by having borne the One Ring. His memories, physical as well as mental, of being wounded by the Witch King's knife, Shelob's stinger, and Golem's bite, ended up being too much for him. Anyway, with all of these things, and this has certainly been interesting, but all of these things that come to mind about World War I, we as readers really ought not to allow this information to make us think that we understand some sort of secret of Tolkien's works. This isn't a key to unlocking anything. It's just insight. It's just an example of information that might be interesting. But we need to remember this is an example of the difference between allegory and applicability. The Dead Marshes are not the trenches of the Somme. They just may have been inspired by the trenches of the Somme. Same with all the other things we've talked about. This isn't going to change our reading. It's just some interesting information. Well, that wraps it up for this mini episode. Shawn and I don't mind flying solo from time to time, but we are looking forward to coming back together this Sunday, March 13th. So please be sure to join us as we finally start our deep dive into Tolkien's legendarium, starting with the opening chapter of the Silmarillion, Ainulindale, perhaps the most beautiful creation myth in all of literature. Now, that'll give you a few days to read, take notes, and jot down questions. Remember, if you need cheap paperbacks to mark up, use the links on our library page at theprancingponypodcast.com. Now, if you haven't done so already, please subscribe to our podcast through iTunes or your favorite podcast app. And like us on Facebook, The Prancing Pony Podcast, so that you can get current updates, listen to previous episodes, and interact with me and Shawn. Leave questions, comments. We really want your interaction. We want your involvement in this. It's not just the two of us talking all the time. And one last thing, don't forget to send your questions, comments, or Dragonfire barbecue recipes to theprancingponypodcast@gmail.com, and we'll try to get them into our next episode. Well, 20 minutes is still far too short a time to spend amongst such admirable listeners, but until next time, farewell.